Hello, I'm Maureen Reidy, the President and CEO of the Paley Center for Media, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to a very important and timely PaleyImpact program, uncovering racial injustice with BET's Disrupt and Dismantle. Never before has Paley's mission been more vital, as media has been the undisputed connector to a nation in these unprecedented times. And Paley is uniquely positioned to meet this moment with impactful conversations led by influential figures, such as the two prominent voices in media that we have with us today. We are excited to welcome Scott Mills, President of BET, and Soledad O'Brien, award-winning journalist and host of Disrupt and Dismantle. This groundbreaking 6-part documentary series is part of BET and Viacom CBS's Content for Change initiative, and it examines the recurring injustice Black people face in America and how communities can rally to effect positive change. Today's PaleyImpact program is also part of our tribute to Women's History Month, as Disrupt and Dismantle also addresses the unique challenges facing women of color in our society. Before we start the program, one brief housekeeping note: if you are tweeting, our hashtag on Twitter is #PaleyImpact. And now it is my honor to introduce a great friend of the Paley Center, Scott Mills, President of BET. Welcome, Scott, and over to you.
Thank you, Maureen. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's wonderful partnering with the Paley Center on this important initiative. We love working with you all. Welcome, everyone, to PaleyImpact, Uncovering Racial Injustice, BET's Disrupt and Dismantle. And I couldn't be more delighted to be joined today by Soledad O'Brien, the award-winning journalist, author, speaker, philanthropist, and CEO of Soledad O'Brien Productions. Soledad and BET have a long partnership of working to identify and explore issues that are important to our community. And we couldn't be more happy with the incredible series that Soledad has created with Disrupt and Dismantle. Soledad, welcome.
Hi, Scott. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So let's jump right in. And maybe what we can do is start, before we talk about Disrupt and Dismantle specifically, let's talk about broadly the opportunity that media has to really play a critical role in driving change in our community. As you know, and as Maureen spoke, BET is working with Viacom CBS around our Content for Change initiative, but truly journalists, right, have been at the forefront of using content for change long before everyone else started thinking about it. So what I'd love to hear from you is, what insights do you have around what are specific content execution strategies, tactics that you've learned that actually really work to drive change? Because that's so much of the focus at the moment.
Yeah, I think we're at a very interesting time. Certainly, if you look at last summer of unrest, I think it was indicative of people just trying to figure out what is happening in this country, and not just Black people or people of color. Really, it seemed to me that for maybe the first time in a long time, a lot of these protests were multiracial, that there were a lot of white people who were trying to understand many of these conversations that I think people in the Black community have been having for a really long time. Lots of people that I know, sort of their eyes were opened. So I think media has this opportunity to think about giving context and giving history and informing people in the most basic sense of what our jobs are and what our roles should be. You know, I think sometimes we don't treat racism like the crisis that it is. And we certainly saw the public thinks it's a crisis, and the public in many ways wants to understand, where did this crisis come from exactly? How do you connect the dots? I mean, did it just pop up over the summer? Obviously, no. And so it was one of the things as we thought about Disrupt and Dismantle, like, how do you take those things that have happened in America historically from slavery, but really looking at maybe policy decisions in the 1930s and 40s, and how that affects people today? And then, of course, connecting to, and so then what do you do about it? And I think when you talk about structural racism, it's so complicated because it's actually a lot easier to say, listen, that person said this thing, they said the N-word, they're a racist. When you're talking about structures and systems, it actually becomes much more complex on both how you understand it and then also how do you tackle it? How do you dismantle it? I mean, that's why, someone said to me the other day, Disrupt and Dismantle is such an aggressive title. I'm like, yes, it is, because I think people are done not being aggressive about changing structures. And I think the media has this tremendous opportunity to just explain to people where we are, and why we are where we are.
I love that. I love that. And are you of the mind, one of the things that's happening is that there's this journalism and public affairs programming has always been focused on this space. But now people are thinking about how do we use the rest of media? How do we use kind of reality programming? How do we use scripted programming? How do we use movies? How do we use stories to really impact these issues? And are you of the mind that there's certain things that you would say, as a journalist, my experience is these three things get people to act or get people to impact people's perceptions, and these couple of things don't? Or is it not that straightforward? And I asked this question, I'm going to jump in for a second, because as a Black man in his mid-50s, right? I recall that when I was a child, every villain in a television series or a movie, whether it was the robber, the rapist, the drug dealer, the prostitute, et cetera, was a Black person, right? And fast forward to 2010, and you can't find a criminal in a series or a movie that is Black. That's the most diverse thing. And I was struck by the fact that while the industry's made this huge pivot, it's clearly had no impact on lethal racism in America, right? And so the point being, well, okay, that's not the change that's going to change perception, beliefs, and outcomes. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on some things that actually do that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because I think you do need, across all levels of culture, to almost take down these myths. As you know, the mythology that Black people can't open a movie, right? I mean, and so there's these constant things that if you're going to have a villain, they should be Black. That if we're going to do a story that's urban, well, everybody should be poor and living in the projects, living in the hood. That the whole entire Midwest has no Black people in it. That when we talk about the working class, wink, wink, we know what we're really talking about, white people. When we talk about evangelicals, wink, wink, we're talking about white people. So I think we're beginning to see across every single sort of entity in media, but even entity generally, people saying like, wow, what is our role in equity? Like, what is our role in changing the conversation? And maybe if we are a law firm, are we doing what we're telling people we're doing? Do we have diversity in our ranks? How many people of color are we promoting? How do we talk about it? Do people come into the company, and they find 3 years later that it's not a place for them and they leave? And instead of saying, I don't know, we say, let's do the uncomfortable work of digging into it. So I think you really have seen this change and shift. And I don't think it's ever going to be just one thing, right? I never think it's going to be, well, you know what, if they just start having Black people open movies, we will have solved racism. I think it's actually going to be across a number of different platforms where these difficult conversations are happening, right? I mean, the other day, Meghan McCain, right, was on The View, basically talking about, well, should I be replaced by an Asian person? You're like, you're actually getting into the conversation about what should diversity look like, by the way, on a show where the ratings are driven by people of color. Let's be clear, So I think we're starting to have, sometimes in very awkward ways, a number of these conversations, but it's never going to be one thing. And I think news is going to have to do one version. I think anytime you talk about, perception and who even exists in these spaces, then you take a step forward in, so somebody can be in this movie. Somebody can play the role of the doctor. Somebody can, be involved in these stories. I love Criminal Minds. I'm obsessed with it, like insanely obsessed. And, one of the things you see very quickly on that show is just how diverse it is, right? Like every time they go to a city where some dead body has shown up, it's always like the chief of police is whatever would make sense in Texas, Baltimore, New York, Louisiana. And I said that to one of the producers. I'm like, wow, this show is so diverse. and diverse in a very authentic way. They're in a border town. It makes sense that these Latinos would be walking through this shot in every which way. And they're like, yeah, we realized that intentionally we were going to add diversity to it. And it didn't have to be, oh, diversity, let's make all the criminals Black dudes.
Right.
It was a much more realistic and thoughtful way of thinking about it, which I appreciated. But I think it's going to have to be on all fronts. And I'm actually encouraged because I think so many organizations are trying to figure out, like, well, then what is our piece of this? Right. And that's kind of new.
Yes, I do think that's new. And speaking of new, so you pioneered using mainstream media to focus on Black issues with Black in America back in the day. And then fast forward to 2020, and you said, I really need to do Disrupt and Dismantle. And to your friend's point, it is an aggressive title, right? And I think you execute it aggressively, which I love. I think it's appropriate. But talk a little bit about your journey from Black in America to Disrupt and Dismantle, and how you think about the time when you created Black in America, the time today, and how the two series differ.
When we did Black in America back in 2008, what was kind of funny was literally an executive said to me, so listen, don't make it too Black. Now the thing is called Black in America. But you know what? I had been in TV news long enough to be like, I got you. Like, I don't even know what that means, but I do know what that means, right? It means, listen, we have an audience we value, and that audience is white. So whatever you do, Soledad, do not drive away our white audience. And again, what's so frustrating about that is when Black in America as a series, and it went on for about 9 years, actually aired, the Black audience grew massively. But the white audience grew even more because people want to understand these issues. And if it's good storytelling, you actually can bring in this big audience. And this idea that, well, only Black people will want to watch Black people and white people will only want to watch white people is so insulting, actually, to your audience. I mean, it's ridiculous. But that's kind of the mindset. I think one thing we failed to do in Black in America that we did this time around in doing Disrupt and Dismantle, one, I think that aggressiveness was a bit of a different approach, but also we were digging much more into history. We didn't just say, oh, here's a family where the Black people and the white people are related through a slaveholder. We didn't kind of do the work, if you will, of like, well, let's dig into that history. Let's talk about how that turned out for both of these families and how their opportunities were a little bit different. In the end, they would meet. I think this go around, we were very interested in this person today. What happened historically that brought us here? And where can they go? What have they done? Deconstruct, what have they done in order to make the change? Because actually dismantling something is a whole heck of a lot of work. And it's not ever about one person. And none of these stories has sort of one heroic individual, which I know newsrooms love to have, the one amazing principal, the one, tremendous nurse. But disrupting systemic racism is about a bunch of people coming together to say, actually, to change the system, we have to change the system, and we're going to do it together. And so I think both on the front end of history and the back end of strategy, it was much more effective and much more important to kind of help people understand how to move forward in a useful way.
That's great. I love that. I was sitting here thinking of all the things that I don't think have ever been said in a BET boardroom. Don't make it too Black would definitely be on that short list of things.
But I was so proud of myself for being like,
Right, I got it. Right.
Got you.
Right. Nicely done. And so Disrupt and Dismantle, it's so powerful. It's so wonderful to watch you navigate these injustices and to see you advocate for people. Equally, it's brutally challenging to watch some of the things that are being inflicted upon our community. Talk about how as a journalist, how do you navigate that space? How do you kind of stay positive ultimately?
Yeah, and I'm not positive at all. I think I'm realistic, and I try to stay in the vein of realistic. And I think the interesting thing for me in many of these interviews was asking people, like, you've been fighting City Hall to remove 100,000 tons of debris, of shingles from your backyard for years. how do you stay positive? And, it's very hard to not be enthusiastic about people who say, well, there's incremental change. It's not going to happen fast. And look at all these people who support me, and look at the local media who's now jumped in, and look at the networks that I'm creating, and look at how we're leveraging local support. I think all of those things, again, we love a narrative of an individual, but the reality is usually it's somebody starting with the individual who just keeps reaching out and reaching out and reaching out. And then at some point, everybody says, I can't believe this hasn't happened before. And the system topples or changes. And sometimes it only changes a little bit, but it's a first step. For me personally, it was really important that no one ever got the sense that somehow that I was replacing any of the work that activists were doing. I mean, we literally popped in to elevate the work that they had been doing, sometimes for a dozen years. I mean, at it for such a long time. And so I think that, was amazing, an opportunity to give them voice and give them a platform. But I'm not always very positive about it. And I think I try to just be realistic about it. So many people, when you're realistic, just didn't even understand the problem. We do a story in Hilton Head. So many people had no idea that Hilton Head was overwhelmingly Black. The first people who were freed as slaves were in Hilton Head Island. And that Hilton Head, which is now kind of the land of the shishi golfer and gated community, has lots of people with multi-million-dollar properties, waterfront properties, who are the heirs, the land, the descendants of slaves, but because they can't really own the land in the way that you and I might go out and buy, or anybody might go buy a property and a house, they're sort of stuck. And so explaining this idea of heirs property, sure, your land is worth $38 million, but if you miss a $2,000 payment, and you're 80, and you and the taxes have gone up because Hilton Head has become very expensive, you can't leverage anything out of your property because you technically kind of sort of don't own it. It's super complicated. But the good news is there are lots of people who are working on that problem, and they're working to really try to figure it out. And so being able to elevate those stories, I think, was really important for me.
I love that. Now, to your point around lots of people working on those things, one of the things that's striking about Disrupt and Dismantle is the consistency with that series and what's broadly happening in society at large. And that is, many people are happy to acknowledge that 2021 is the year of the Black woman, right? We've seen Black women use their extraordinary efforts, networks, and the investments that they've made in communities and infrastructures to really drive a lot of change in the country in 2020. And that thread pulls through when you watch Disrupt and Dismantle. So many of the people who are really at the forefront of trying to drive change in their communities are Black women. One thing that I'm curious about is we can look at that very positively and say, thank God for Black women, which we absolutely do. But we can also ask the question, why does this responsibility seem to have fallen disproportionately on Black women? And I'm curious if you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, I do, because I think I look at my mom, who did a lot of work in fair housing in Long Island, which, I think she really kept from us when we were growing up, right? We just didn't have family conversations around the dinner table about the lack of access, but it was a lot of the work that she did. And I think there's a certain power in being an outsider and an insider, right? Like you're not invited around the table really. And so you're going to kind of have to break down the door and bring your little folding chair, be like, hey, I'm here. And I'm not, I don't want so desperately to be part of a system that's going to fail my very people. So I'm willing to live as an outsider. And I've just seen that so much. Like, I think Black women are unafraid of being a little unpopular. And Black women are, you look at Gabrielle Union, right? She just stands up for what she believes in. She's just today's example, because I was following her on Twitter this morning, just like it would be so much easier to just say the right thing and go along. But like, I think she feels like if I don't say something, who is the person here who's going to say something? If it's not me, then nobody. And so then it has to be me. And there are so many Black women that I know personally, and then also whose stories we just tell, where I think they feel, if they feel lucky enough to have made it kind of around the table and into the room, they just feel the obligation of, then I'm here for a reason. And if I'm here for a reason, then I've got to say a thing. And so I think that's part of it. It certainly was for my mom, and I do think people are beginning, when I used to tell stories, when I go back in the day when we actually went out of our bedrooms,
Right.
I would do like college graduations, and I would tell the story about my parents, who were an interracial couple, and how they couldn't get married, and college students had no idea, because I think they thought like, well, sure, back in the slave days. I'm like, no, this was, my parents' marriage wasn't legal till after I was born and after my little brother was born. And I think they just don't understand the history. And so helping people to understand that, I think that's also often the role of kind of the truth tellers, who are frequently Black women, who are kind of like, if there is a cost to me, so be it, because there is a greater good that is more important.
That's fantastic. And it's, and thank God for it. I was on a call with Reverend Al this morning, and we were talking about, while there's so much that we all have to do still, that the changes that occurred in 2020, at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, obviously, kind of create a much better foundation for us to tackle everything that's in front of us. And to that point, so a lot of people would describe 2020 as a year where everyone had to react, right? We had to react to COVID, we had to react to remote working, remote schooling, we had to react to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and we had to react to certainly to the elections. 2021 so far is pacing itself in a way that it looks like people get to be proactive. So when you think about what's on your list around the things that you want to be very proactive about and your kind of commitment for driving change, in addition to disrupt and dismantle, what is it that you're looking to be very proactive around?
People think I'm crazy, but I am all about measuring. Don't talk to me about the big strategies you have for your organization. Show me the numbers. We host a show called Matter of Fact that airs syndicated around the country on Sundays. And, I would tell people we're a very diverse show, and that has really driven our ratings. We have the age of our viewership, and the diversity of our viewership is great. And so, and people will say, what do you do? Like count the people? I'm like, yes, we have a spreadsheet. And we make sure that, we have diversity in the economists we have on, that we are experts. There's lots of Black women who are scientists who could be put on television. And again, if I'm not going to do it, who's going to do it? And so I have always really loved the idea that for a lot of the projects we do, we kind of nurture people and then they get snatched by somebody else and they're suddenly featured on somebody else's show. I love that. Like, great, start with me. And then you become the face of, being an economist or being a doctor or being a scientist in some capacity. And so, we track and measure. You can't just tell me, we are going to work really hard in hiring people of color. Show me. And show me where you failed and show me where you succeeded. And if you failed, as if we were doing refrigerators, you would say, wow, we failed. Everybody on that refrigerator team would meet, right? And they'd say, where did we fail? What are we not doing well? Okay, for next year, here's our new strategy. I find in hiring, you often have like, yeah, well, I don't know. It must be them. And it's not. And so I think it's actually changing. I actually, again, because I'm often privy to these conversations, and sometimes I'm brought in to moderate them. And I think you hear people changing their strategy on how they think about diversity and diverse hires and supporting people and making sure the content is diverse. I mean, and step one is just a very specific, detailed conversation about it and making that okay. And then saying, how are we following up? Listen, I would love to work out 5 days a week. If I don't track it, I do not. I get to about 2 days a week. And that's, and because that's, all the good wishes in the world, don't make it happen. Absolutely. And I think the same thing in how we think about equality and equity and fairness and diversity. Track those numbers and hold yourselves accountable. If there were anything else, computers, refrigerators, I don't know, whatever, every single person in that organization would be responsible. No one would get to say, I don't know why this refrigerator is not selling. I have no idea. It doesn't work like that.
That's
and
right.
I would just like those things done the same way for human beings.
Right. Right. That sounds exactly what Melody Hobson has been saying that for the longest, right? She said, everything in corporate America is measured. There are goals set against it. There's compensation set against those goals. And when people fall short, there are consequences. The only place that there's no consequence is around the equity inclusion goals. So I love that alignment. And
I've stolen a lot of that from Melody because we've sat on boards together. And I think because she works in finance, right, she has this incredible credibility to be able to tell people, ergo, it's not okay. So don't sit here and tell me it's unknowable. It is not unknowable, and I am a high-ranking woman of color who tells you can do this.
Right. Now back to disrupt and dismantle for a second. So you covered an amazing array of situations. The one that was most painful for me to watch was the school, the prison pipeline. Across the 6 episodes, what were some of the most surprising things to you?
I tell you, I nearly fell on my seat in that episode when they talked about the number of small children in elementary school who are put into cuffs.
Right.
If you had asked me to guess, I would have been like, I don't know, 1, maybe 2, because once you do that, everyone would be horrified and realize that, boy, they had made a horrific mistake. It's not. And so it gives you some insight into just how the system is failing. Who in their right mind? I have 4 kids, and listen, often not particularly well-behaved children, but who in their right mind thinks cuffing a small child is a strategy? That's insane. And as we know from that particular segment, we know the minute you start sending a child down the shunt of criminal justice, right? Everything framed by, well, this is now a sheriff's issue, a police officer's issue. That fight is assault 1. Now it kind of goes down the shunt of the criminal justice system. You really put this child's life and how they could end up in severe peril. So that was one thing that I just could not believe that number. That was insane. And then I also think, when we looked at policing in Chicago, and Jeanette, the woman who was left bare for about 13 minutes while police broke into her home, they thought that they had the right home for a warrant, but they had the wrong location, right? So completely their fault. They were wrong. They were in the wrong. And to leave a human being standing there naked for 13 minutes while you search her apartment, and she's saying, you have the wrong home. She's a social worker. She's a church lady. This idea of, like, was there no one in the room? Was there not one soul who thought, oh my goodness, let me get a house coat for this woman, right? Even as everything's unfolding and it's chaotic, like, oh my goodness, let us take a moment to preserve her dignity because she's a human being. And the number of officers who were in that house, some days it's almost hard to wrap your head around that you could treat someone so dismissively, like they're not even human, right? They're not even human, so they don't deserve to have a robe or a towel or given a moment to just put a sweatshirt on. It's that, to me, that was so upsetting. I mean, obviously horribly upsetting to her, but just so personally upsetting to me. So that when people are looking for examples of, well, how are people treated unjustly? You have to say, do you really think a young white woman who was standing there naked would be allowed to stand there? Of course not. Of course not. And that's what, she says. And I agree with her on that. So I think that those 2 things were just appalling and yet not, they weren't the one and only,
right.
That happens relatively consistently.
Right. Well, a natural follow-up to that was 6 episodes, 6 extraordinary situations that you highlighted. If you were to do a 7th, what would the 7th have been? What would the 7th have been? We
had so many ideas, right? Because you really start with what, I hate the phrase character, but you start with the person, right? Whose story is going to be what draws you in. And they have to be a compelling human being who you want to watch even if they're eating cereal. You know what I'm really interested in, and then because we look next at like policy and how did policy intersect with what they're trying to do. But I look at something like the GI Bill. I grew up in Long Island. I look at housing in Levittown, right? Because people don't understand the injustice in home ownership. The GI Bill, everyone's like, yeah, the GIs were able to, get access to go to college. Well, not really. And so much of history is like, yeah, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. Well, not really. And I feel like sometimes my job is well, not really. And so there's so many things that explain the inequality in Black home ownership and Black wealth today, which we didn't really tackle. We did in some ways. But if you look at a town like Levittown, which is not too far from where I grew up, where, Black people were not allowed to buy into those homes. And you just look at the wealth that was created in that community for only certain people. You can see how people who couldn't buy in there would then be relegated to less valuable properties. And you could actually do an entire through line that says, look how these people ended up and the value of what they were able to pass on to their children. And then look at these people who were left out of the system and the value of what they were able to pass on to their family and their children. And I think that kind of thing is so important because sometimes I hear these conversations, they're so disconnected from reality. Like there is a reason why there is this massive gap in Black wealth. It didn't just happen. When you are a slave, your ability to make income is actually going to impact your descendants down the road. Then we talk about Jim Crow. Then we talk about discrimination. There's just the explanation, I think, plus the character is always the thing that really moves me to explain to people, this is why we are where we are. I actually used to, wanted to pitch a show years ago called like, how the hell do we get here? Because like you wanted to explain to people, for example, I grew up in Long Island. And so Robert Moses State Park, many people don't realize Robert Moses was a horrific bigot, in addition to being an industrialist who built a lot of Long Island. And so he made sure that the overpasses out to Robert Moses State Park were too low for buses. Why? He did not want Black and brown people.
Wow.
Wow. And it's intentional. And it's not just Long Island. Look at like how highways go, in Atlanta, what neighborhoods have a turnoff from the highway and what neighborhoods have to drive and twist and drive in order to get to the highway. There is this incredible racism in transportation. It sounds like you're a crazy person when you say that, but anybody who really knows says, yep, those kinds of stories I think are just fascinating.
That's right. And that leads me to a question. I was working with my colleagues, some of whom were on this session earlier today, and we were looking at all of the commitments and announcements that media companies made in response to this moment of racial reckoning, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And given your position as an independent producer journalist, are you seeing just kind of an extraordinary array of opportunities? Is this kind of a watershed moment where everybody wants to kind of get behind any idea that you have, or how are you experiencing that?
I think to some degree that's very true, but I think the real magic is in the next iteration of it, which is this. When we do a series, we hire a whole bunch of Black people. And so now those employees are associate producers and executive producers, they're editors, right? And now no one can say, where is the pipeline? We'd love to hire Black people, but just no pipeline. No, we have the pipeline. We're creating the pipeline. And so I think the real magic is in when you open up those opportunities, then the people who say, great, here's the team. We have so many talented people of color who are working on our staff and working on these projects. I'm blown away by, they're young, they're so smart, they're amazing. And I feel like for the work, they're working with us, but even as we put them out into the world, like they are getting amazing work on their resumes. They're getting to be that next iteration of what exists, as opposed to someone saying, and I will quote our little friend Meghan McCain about this, right? Like, somehow she didn't get an opportunity, who's qualified. And as you know, that's a conversation people like to have. Oh, we'd love to hire someone of color, but They're just not qualified. Well, guess what? We are leveraging this opportunity to make sure that the staff is qualified, that we are putting out into the world lots of incredibly talented people who can point to the amazing work that they've done and exactly what they did in that work. And so that's the thing that I feel most proud of. Like, that's the goal, right? It can't just be me. If I'm your diversity plan, then you are in serious trouble. Right. It has to be a organization, a company that then brings behind it a whole bunch of other people to really change the narrative and also change the work.
That's right. That's right. McKinsey released a report earlier this month analyzing diversity and inclusion and the challenges for Black professionals and talent in specifically the television and film business. And they cited everything that you cited. They cited the lack of sponsorship, the lack of opportunity. They cited, in particular, they cited that all of the conventions and the lack of formality around the media business kind of create tremendous barriers to people of color.
Hire your friend, right? Everybody hires their friend. We're going to interview 3 people, but at the end of just wait 3 weeks because we're hiring you. But I got to interview these folks. Make it look fair.
Right. Yeah, so it is, I think the fact that you're focused on creating that pipeline is extraordinary. I do want to credit, I not a commercial, but we at BET recently presented to all of Viacom this idea that because the BET executive team is part of these extensive networks that we all know that exist within the Black community, whether it's professional networks or whether it's social networks or collegiate networks, that those networks are so robust, and that in ways that are dissimilar from other communities, we're all if there's 6 degrees of separation, there's kind of 1 degree of separation in our community. And we've said that we recognize that everybody does want to really move the needle, and therefore we want to put ourselves and the Viacom Black Leadership Council forward as a resource to all of the senior executives across the company, in particular when they're doing senior executive searches, because if their recruiters are telling them, well, we just couldn't find any, before you accept that, give us a call. And to the credit, one of my colleagues reached out last night specifically to say, okay, I'm not seeing candidates. Can you all help? So I think it's an important moment, and it really does evidence the way the world is changing. So I love
it's a virtuous circle, right? Because the next, for people of color who are highly sought after, they're going to say, so who else works here? I don't want to be the only Black person in this company, right? And suddenly everyone says, oh, hold on. And how am I going to be successful? And what does my path here look like? Because I actually am being recruited by 4 other companies. So what do you have to offer me that I would want to come here? Because I am not your diversity hire. I am really good at my job, and I am going to help you grow your audience, which is what you want. And so I think it creates this virtuous circle of then you have to do better because you're not going to get the great people. They're going to go to another place.
That's right. That's right. And I hope that through all the work that everyone's doing, and I know the boards on which you sit and the work that you're doing, that we can really all move the needle. And I guess that would be my question to you. You are engaging with a really broad universe of corporate entities. Lots of people have made extraordinary commitments. We're all approaching the anniversary of George Floyd's death. We're approaching kind of the anniversary of these extraordinary commitments. Are you optimistic that these companies are going to do everything they've said and that it will have impact? Or are you kind of concerned that this was a moment in time and that the focus will shift and this will dissipate?
Yes, I'm optimistic-ish, because I think people lose their focus no matter what the topic is we're talking about. You lose focus. But I was doing this event for this big giant insurance company, just moderating a conversation. And one of their executives, who's this Black guy, high ranking executive, they opened up, they asked their Black employees to just tell stories. And this guy is super gregarious, really nice guy, big guy, handsome guy. Everyone loves him, that kind of guy. And he told the story of going down to his basement and how he heard a noise. So he goes down to the basement to explore, and the back door in the basement is open. Mm. And he said, so I sat there for a few minutes, literally trying to decide, it's 9:00 at night. Do I call the cops or do I just close the door and go to bed?
Oh my.
And he said, I closed the door and went to bed. Right. And I think his colleagues were so blown away, right? Because as much as they were moved by George Floyd, they don't think of him, this Black executive, as George Floyd, right? They could not believe, like, but you are afraid that at 9 o'clock at night, when things are getting dark and scary, that you might be considered the suspect. You might not even be safe in your own house. And I just remember nobody spoke. People could not believe it. And I think this window has been opened up to these conversations. He said another thing too. He said, he's known as being very friendly. And he said, well, you want to know why I say hi to the guy who is the doorman, and why I say hi to the guy where you have to swipe your ID, and why I say hi to the folks at the security desk. He says, because one day I'm going to come in and I'm not going to be in a suit, and someone's going to challenge me for being here. And I'm going to need all of those people to know who I am, right? And I think for the first time, his white colleagues were like, he's actually in danger.
Right.
He's funny, he's friendly, he's a big dude, he's happy, but this is how he navigates his everyday. And I think moving from the tragedy of George Floyd to this is what reality is like for people of color who you know, who you like, who you think of as one of your own, I think that's opening a lot of eyes. And they're not the only organization that's doing those conversations. So I think it's a little bit different this go around. I really do. I think these companies are like, the government's not going to solve this. So what is our role in changing that? How do we fix that?
Right. Well, I hope you're right. And we're doing research to understand what storytelling techniques will actually change people's perceptions and beliefs. But I do think my bias, as it were, is that if we can have people whom other communities perceive as being kind of not subject to the challenges that our community is, and then we can share that and expose that, I think it will ultimately help people kind of evolve their perception.
Absolutely, right? Because I think the worst thing someone can say is, well, not really you. Right. I mean, I'm talking about these guys. He's not really you. And you're like, no, really, he is me, right? Like, really, George Floyd is any Black guy who finds himself in an interaction with police. There are going to be assumptions that are made. And so how do you move from that one person in that one scenario at that one time to, we have to change outcomes generally, because this is universally unfair and dangerous for people of color.
Absolutely. Well, I thank you, Soledad, for, first of all the work you do, not just with us, but across the spectrum, because it's such important work, and you're such an effective advocate and an effective change maker. And that's what we need. We need everybody in there using all of their influence and pushing all the levers, because I think, to your point, there is no silver bullet, right? It's going to be a layering effect that is going to help us really turn the corner here. So I thank you so much. I thank you for your extraordinary work on Disrupt and Dismantle. It's incredible. And I look forward to, as a guy who used to be a banker, I'm fascinated by the Levittown mortgage wealth creation dynamic. So I'm vulnerable to green lighting a seventh. So, but
we love vulnerability. As a person who runs a production company, we love the vulnerability to green lighting. That's the greatest phrase I've ever heard.
Right.
Thank you. And thank you for the compliments. I have to say, we had an amazing team. So I truly appreciate that. And I will make sure that they all are well aware, because it was their work, which was phenomenal.
Great. Well, wonderful. Well, we look forward to continuing to work with you. We look forward to doing more. And thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for PaleyImpact. Be sure to support the Paley Center and consider becoming a Paley member by visiting paleycenter.org.